One of the guys who no longer wears ties.
He's rubbing
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharon Squassoni, and I direct the Proliferation Prevention program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here today for our session on, I better check the title, U.S. Policy Directions in Limiting Enrichment and Reprocessing. My initial plan for this panel was to invite someone from the State Department to talk about diplomatic approaches to limiting the risks of enrichment and reprocessing, inviting someone from the Department of Energy to talk about technical programs and approaches to do the same, and then have an outside expert to raise some questions for us to think about on these issues. Of course, the more illustrious your guests are, the less likely you are to get these experts to stay exactly on topic. So we may hear some broader ruminations about the linkages of nuclear energy and non-proliferation. So I see a lot of experts in the audience, but there may be those who are not quite as steeped in these topics, so I'm going to just set the stage for you for a moment. Last month, Washington hosted the Nuclear Security Summit, which was designed to reduce the risks that weapons-usable nuclear material might fall into the hands of nuclear terrorists. That material is highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium. Today, we are going to focus on how well we're doing in the civilian nuclear energy sector in reducing the risks that A, those materials will grow, and B, that the technologies to produce those materials, enrichment and reprocessing, might spread. So before I begin the formal introductions of our speakers, I need to make a few administrative announcements. First, today we are on the record and we're simultaneously webcasting. For courtesy's sake, please silence your cell phones. And I actually have to do that with mine.
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's do that. And we also have emergency procedures in the event of emergency, which I'm hoping nothing will happen. We have our security officer, Yukari Sekaguchi, in the background, who's waving her arm. She's the person to follow. So pay attention to her in case anything happens. Our speakers today will speak each for about 10 to 15 minutes. After that, I will ask some burning questions of my own and see if we can get these guys to ask each other questions. And then we'll have plenty of time for your questions in the audience. First up, we are going to hear from Assistant Secretary of State Thomas Countryman, who has led the State Department's International Security and Non-Proliferation Bureau efforts for the last 5 years. Tom has a long and illustrious career in the Foreign Service spanning decades. He now holds the rank of Minister Counselor. Among other jobs, he served at the U.S. mission to the UN, advising then Ambassador Albright as a liaison to UNSCOM back the first time around in the 1990s with Iraq. And he served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs and also the Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. After Tom, we'll hear from Ed McGinnis from the Department of Energy, who is responsible for DOE's international civilian nuclear energy activities, including policy and research and development. He is the steering group chairman of IFNEC, which is the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation. He is also the DOE's representative to the U.S. Trade and Promotion Coordination Committee on Civil Nuclear Energy Matters, and he's the principal U.S. rep to the Generation 4 International Forum. He's also responsible for technical oversight of, you know, your bio said USEC, but it's not USEC anymore.
No, we need to update that, don't we?
Yeah, Centris.
But it was looking back in the
Looking
past.
back,
So.
well, U.S. Enrichment Corporation, or whatever it is now, Centris, and Uranium and Inventory Management. And finally, we have Dr. Bob Gallucci, who is the Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he was dean from 1996 to 2009. He also served as the president of the MacArthur Foundation from 2009 to 2014. And during his 2 decades of public service, he, among other things, negotiated the landmark 1994 Agreed Framework with North Korea, and served also as the Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs and Deputy Executive Chairman of UNSCOM. So, without further ado, I will give the floor to Tom.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Sharon, for organizing this event. It's an honor to speak to this group. I recognize a number of genuine experts in the audience today. And while I can't match your expertise, I can at least pretend to speak for the U.S. government in my limited sphere of authority. I think the remarks I'd like to make today will be a little bit broader than only talking about enrichment and reprocessing, but instead to talk about the potential and the challenges of the expansion of civilian nuclear energy in the world. So of course, I'll be talking not just about the markets, the potential, but the role that's assigned to my bureau. How do we keep a vigilant eye on programs around the world for any concern about non-proliferation or related issues? And of course, it's important to understand the context for the potential expansion of civilian nuclear energy around the world. My boss, Secretary Kerry, in a speech earlier this month, noted that the global transition to low-carbon alternatives is crucial to preserving infrastructure, food production, water supplies, ecosystems, and global health. When we talk about the future of energy, he said, we are actually talking about the future of everything. And within that context, nuclear power plays an important role and potentially a still greater role in the future. Today, nuclear energy is an important source of electricity in many large economies, including China, the United States, and India. And of course, we talk about it in connection with the Paris climate goals precisely because it does not emit carbon pollution. In fact, it's difficult to see how China or the United States or India or a few other countries can meet the established Paris climate goals without increased reliance on nuclear power. It's an essential part of President Obama's clean energy strategy for reducing carbon emissions. And I remind you that this strategy has three key elements: supporting economic growth and job creation, enhancing energy security, and deploying all of the above, all possible low-carbon energy technologies to lay the foundation for a clean energy future. Now, the United States, industry and government, is not just a pioneer and a technical leader in the field of civil nuclear energy, but we're also a leader in promoting the safety and security of nuclear power programs. Now, not every country in the world should pursue nuclear power as an option. There are questions of affordability, and above all, questions of infrastructure, both physical and human infrastructure, that make nuclear power a suboptimal choice for a number of countries around the world. We strongly believe that countries should only enter into the business of civil nuclear energy, a business that requires a commitment of not a generation, but hundreds and thousands of years. They should only enter this once they've established the necessary infrastructure to sustain such a program. This includes setting up an independent civil regulatory authority, the legal framework, the nuclear safety programs, and a workforce with the technical skill not just to operate the equipment, but to make tough technical choices and to oversee the operators of the equipment. Now, the United States government supports the development of both the human and the physical infrastructure through global programs, primarily from the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the State Department also not only supports their training programs, but we support nuclear capacity building through the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Global Nuclear Safety and Security Network, and regional groups, such as the Asian Nuclear Safety and Security Network. And of course, it is within the United States, the educational sector, our universities, colleges, technical schools, that perform a major role in developing the necessary human resources for nuclear energy, not only for the United States, but for many other countries as well. And when I speak with other countries about the potential for nuclear energy and what they need to do to prepare for it, I ask them to look at a couple of excellent examples of countries that carefully laid this groundwork. And especially I cite the United Arab Emirates and Vietnam as countries that did their homework before making decisions on nuclear power. Second, I want to emphasize that safety has been at the top of the priority list for a very long time. And of course, its importance is underscored by the tragedy at Fukushima Daiichi 5 years ago. The United States worked diligently with the IAEA and with other IAEA member states to improve global nuclear safety, to learn the lessons from that accident. And today, the U.S. plays a lead role in the implementation of the Convention on Nuclear Safety, which commits nations that operate nuclear power plants to maintain a high level of safety. And we have a major role within the IAEA in the strengthening of the agency's safety standards. Now, this work, not just by the U.S. government, but by the U.S. industry and our readiness to learn lessons, means that the U.S. today has achieved the safest nuclear operating fleet in the world. And third, beyond safety, we highlight security. As Sharon mentioned, the Nuclear Security Summit just 3 weeks ago highlighted the commitment that this administration has made to nuclear security. And it has enabled us to focus the attention of the whole world on the importance of providing for security of nuclear materials. With the gains made through the summit process, the chances of terrorists getting their hands on fissile material has greatly diminished. President Obama's commitment to an international summit process to discuss a single topic added the urgency, the focus that enabled the world to make specific, concrete improvements in nuclear security. And finally, as important as civil nuclear energy is to carbon-free energy goals, we recognize that the spread of civil nuclear power can come with an increased risk of proliferation and diversion into nuclear weapons programs. This does not need to be the case. As many of you know, the United States has a long-standing policy of discouraging the spread of sensitive nuclear fuel cycle technologies, including enrichment and reprocessing, to the greatest extent possible. These technologies can be used to produce and separate weapons-usable material, not just the non-weapons grade nuclear fuel used in commercial plants. Now, in our view, there is no contradiction between limiting the spread of these technologies and the continued expansion of peaceful civil nuclear energy. Lack of domestic enrichment and reprocessing capability has not constrained any state in the world from developing a civil nuclear industry. There simply are not credible economic or commercial reasons for countries not already doing so to enrich or reprocess nuclear fuel. The international nuclear fuel market offers reliable, competitively priced services that make the cost of developing a domestic enrichment capacity uneconomical. The world now has such a surplus in nuclear fuel production capacity that if all nuclear plants now under consideration are built, we would still have enough fuel to power them. Under these conditions, it makes little economic sense for new countries to enter into the enrichment and reprocessing business. The issues surrounding reprocessing, of course, are similar and they are difficult. 30 or 40 years ago, when the world's confirmed reserves of uranium was much lower than they are estimated to be today, there was a plausible economic argument for separating plutonium from spent fuel via reprocessing. Since that time, proven reserves of uranium have grown. We know that low-enriched uranium will remain less expensive than mixed oxide MOX fuel made with reprocessed plutonium for the foreseeable future. And advances in dry cask storage technology have proven that there's a safe way to store spent fuel. In light of this, it makes sense to avoid the concerns. Plutonium separation, in short, offers no economic advantage, no advantage in terms of an assured fuel supply, and only raises genuine concerns about proliferation risk. The choice is so clear that most countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, are getting out of the business or have already exited. And finally, there's the geopolitical implications of enrichment and reprocessing. Positive energy relationships contribute to positive diplomatic relationships. The relationships reinforce each other and strengthen the existing nuclear fuel markets. Transparent energy relationships contribute to transparent business interactions, which are also positive for political relations. As we look towards future financing of nuclear power plants, I'm concerned about the lack of transparency in the nuclear business in some countries. As those of you in the business know, public opposition to nuclear power plant projects can be rooted in both rational and emotional reasons. But if there are, in addition, concerns about the lack of transparency, about non-transparent deals, about side payments, they can contribute to a generalized distrust of the entire nuclear industry. To the extent that nuclear energy becomes associated with corrupt business practices, any nuclear renaissance could contain the seeds of its own demise. I'm equally concerned about situations where energy dependency leads to political dependency. For example, Ukraine depends upon Russia for natural gas and for nuclear fuel. And we have seen Ukraine's dependency exploited as a political tool. This ought to be a cautionary tale for us in the nuclear field as well. So how do we use our bilateral and our multilateral relationships to advance clean nuclear energy? First, our civil nuclear cooperation agreements, the 1, 2, 3 agreements, require our partners to adhere to stringent, legally binding non-proliferation conditions, including full-scope IAEA nuclear safeguards in non-nuclear weapon states, effective physical protection measures, an assurance that all cooperation will be used for peaceful uses, and U.S. consent rights over any retransfer, reprocessing, or enrichment of materials covered by the agreement. And because our 1, 2, 3 agreements contain the highest global non-proliferation standards, it's in the U.S. interest to maximize the number of states with whom we have such agreements and who adhere to these conditions. These controls are applied, of course, through our nuclear exports, and so it is also in our non-proliferation interest to maintain U.S. leadership in the global market for nuclear fuel, equipment, and technology. The United States, of course, is no longer an unchallenged leader in this field, so it remains critical to have the kind of partnership with countries around the world that reinforce the same standards. In doing all this, we support the goals, not just of exporting U.S. material, which is valuable to us, but more importantly, exporting United States norms and expectations and minimizing the number of sensitive fuel cycle facilities worldwide. Now, if we don't execute 1, 2, 3 agreements with other countries, we run the risk that they move forward without us, partnering instead with countries that are less transparent in financing, that have fewer stringent non-proliferation controls, and that may have lower standards of safety than what the United States industry is committed to. So it's in our interest to find ways through these agreements to encourage partners to sign up to the high standards that we promote. And here it's important to say a word about the multilateral role of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA plays the critical, respected, impartial role in the verification of peaceful nuclear programs. It has the ability to detect the diversion of declared nuclear material, the misuse of declared nuclear facilities, as well as to detect clandestine nuclear activities. The additional protocol of the IAEA is the essential foundation for the ability to detect these activities, particularly those related to enrichment and reprocessing at early stages. The additional protocol is increasingly accepted not just as the standard for international safeguards and transparency, but also as a basis for bilateral and multilateral nuclear cooperation. The AP facilitates this cooperation by providing stronger assurances that such cooperation will not contribute to weapons programs, even as it helps to deter states from even thinking about such programs. And that, of course, is what the discussion is all about in the case of Iran. The Joint Comprehensive Program of Action constrains Iran's enrichment capacity. It codifies Iran's intent never to pursue reprocessing activity, and it imposes unprecedented verification measures on the entire nuclear supply chain. And having the greater insight into that supply chain for the IAEA makes it virtually impossible for Iran to keep clandestine nuclear activities concealed. And very importantly, the JCPOA requires Iran to implement the additional protocol, which gives the agency the expanded rights of access to information and sites in Iran. And as we ensure that the IAEA has what it needs to carry out its critical monitoring role under the JCPOA, we are working to further strengthen the IAEA and the safeguards regime in particular. Finally, the consequence of the JCPOA, in my view, means that fewer states in the Middle East or beyond will have the same incentive to follow the economically irrational path that Iran followed, seeking to develop domestically an enrichment capacity. So, brief summation, civil nuclear power is critical to meeting not just growing energy demands, but environmental obligations to which the world has now agreed. And if civil nuclear energy becomes more widespread, the United States, for itself and for its leadership in the world, has to maintain a focus on the safety and security and non-proliferation obligations of building this program. So with that, I look forward to listening to my good colleagues and then engaging in discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Ed?
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you, Tom. So when I saw the agenda today, or the other day when Sharon asked if I'd like to come and speak, I immediately said yes, because the subjects that are being focused on today, twofold, which represent, frankly, the culmination of my 25 years of work in the federal government, and that is non-proliferation and civil nuclear energy. In fact, the first 10 years or so of my career was focused on non-proliferation. I worked in various areas such as materials control and accounting, MPC&A as we call it, in Russia, warhead security up in the Northern Fleet, worked on establishing the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, worked on research reactor spent fuel return program, core conversion, and other exciting areas. And about 10 years ago, I was asked to come over and work on the other side of the coin, the civil nuclear side. And it was an amazing change. And really approaching the civil nuclear side, two sides of the same coin, with still the absolute same imperative. that is, whatever we do in the civil nuclear industry, as President Obama had made clear in 2009 in the Prague speech, which still today is my driving principle, and that is, whatever we do, if and when one accesses peacefully nuclear energy, we must do it in a way that does not increase proliferation risks, period. That is period. And the second half of my career working in civil nuclear energy, I had the opportunity and continue today as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Nuclear to help lead bilateral work with dozens of countries around the world, from China, France, Japan, Argentina, Vietnam, Korea. And also, I had the wonderful opportunity to serve as the chair, and I continue to do so, for the international framework that Sharon mentioned. There's 65 countries in that framework. It's led primarily by energy planning authorities. The purpose of that framework is, first and foremost, to look at civil nuclear from electrons on the grid perspective, power generation purposes, of course, with the emphasis on nonproliferation and safety and security. So, after nearly 25 years of my career looking back, first in nonproliferation and now in civil nuclear, and looking at the agenda today, I've looked back and thought about what has really struck me as the most significant takeaways in my journey. And I would say the dramatic change that has occurred in the global commercial civil nuclear industry. It is fundamentally, it is structurally, it is dramatically different from the 90s and the early 2000s. That is a fact. What makes a difference? First of all, when I was working in nonproliferation, with all due respect, I think it was a little bit less complicated because you had a static situation. You did not have a bow wave of countries seeking to develop nuclear energy. You did not have the large array of very eager suppliers that you do today. You didn't have the drivers that we have today, climate. You didn't have quite the energy security driver that you have now for nuclear, and other drivers for civil nuclear that you see in customer markets around the world, that I see on a day-to-day basis. So what do we see today? We see an expansion. Even post-Fukushima, you see an expansion of the global nuclear fuel cycle from a customer market and from a fuel supply reactor technology. That is also another fact. Who do we see? Of course, we see something that is about to become absolutely historic. We're going to see reactors go online in the United Arab Emirates at the Baraka plant. As Tom said, in my view, they have done an excellent job in doing the proper preparations and infrastructure development, and they should be lauded for that. This was not done quickly. They've done it thoughtfully over the years. You also have other countries. You have Turkey now planning to build multiple units. You have Bangladesh. You have Egypt. You have Vietnam. You have others looking, considering seriously. You have Saudi Arabia. You have Kenya. You have Ghana, Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, Morocco, and others. So that's one difference. Let's look at it another way. From a commercial civil nuclear perspective, the IAEA projects that as many as 160 plus reactors, new reactors, are going to be built in the next 10 years. From a commercial market perspective, some estimate that's as much as $750 billion market. In the next 20 years, projections are as many as 320 plus units around the world in 20 plus countries, equaling about 1.7 or so trillion. This is big business. This is a huge economic sector in many ways. Korea's win of the APR 1400 in Baraka was the single largest international commercial deal they have ever made. $20 to $30 billion for that deal. So there is a robust market even post-Fukushima. In fact, the projections are that we may see as many as at least 20 additional countries beyond the 30 that are using nuclear now, in our lifetime certainly. And that has many implications from a supply, from a customer, and from a non-proliferation perspective. Absolutely. So who are the suppliers? Why did I say the suppliers have changed? And they have changed dramatically. I just returned recently from Beijing and Seoul and meeting with a number of the suppliers. It is remarkable how quickly China has pivoted to the export market, and they have pivoted vigorously. They have three major, well-capitalized utilities, CNNC, CGN, and SPIC now that had acquired recently SMPTC. They are serious competition, and they are now very vigorously looking at the international market for export opportunities. You have France, obviously. You have Japan with multiple vendors. You have Korea, which is really an ascending supplier, and we must take great note of that and also encourage them to be part of the leadership solution for civil nuclear and non-proliferation and partnership. And then you have other countries. Canada continues to support its exports. We have, obviously, Russia, very, very forward-leaning in market capture. And the United States, we still have multiple suppliers. Certainly, we have GEH, we have Westinghouse, and then we have what I think is very promising potentially in the small modular reactor sector. And then finally, what are the drivers that have changed? The drivers include, first and foremost, in my view, energy security. One only needs to look at what Tom was mentioning, Ukraine, to see just how critical the role of nuclear is. Over 50% of their electricity is from nuclear. They have 15 reactors, and they had a monopoly-dependent situation from Russia for not only the fuel supply, but for the take-back, either one of which, if they were cut off, could have very significant impacts on their ability to operate those plants. You have other drivers, economic, jobs, significant infusion of infrastructure, well-paying, skilled jobs when countries are able to deploy a nuclear power plant. And then finally, last but not least, one only needs to look at COP21, the climate. One only needs to go to Beijing and see the pollution that faces the residents every day. One can go in many parts of the world and see firsthand what it means for a country to want to move away from a heavy carbon-dependent electricity generation portfolio. There is a strong, strong driver that is increasing, in my view, for countries to look for baseload 24/7 electricity generation, and that includes nuclear. So I think it's worth pointing out that globally, just like in the US, there is a disproportionately large percentage of clean electricity generated from the fleet of reactors. And worldwide, with 440 or so reactors, actually constitutes about 11% of electricity generated. But if you look at it from the clean portfolio, it's about 40% of all the clean electricity generated in the world. In the United States, 19%, almost 20% electricity generated from nuclear based on 99 units. What does that mean? It means about 60% of our entire clean portfolio is nuclear. So nuclear is playing and is going to continue to play a very important role. Challenges. What are the challenges given the changes that have occurred? The very, very dynamic and transitional, if you will, global civil nuclear industry. One is the most obvious. How do you ensure, how do we work hard to make sure that we have an expansion where countries are choosing to develop nuclear for the first time, but not increase proliferation risks? How do you do that? That is the priority. How do you do it? I would say you can do it in multiple ways, and I'm going to hit those very briefly as my final points. But first and foremost, we also need to recognize that we need to come up with commercial and government solutions. In the 90s, when I worked non-proliferation, as I said, it was a little bit of at least it was static. So one could arguably take more of a contain and constrain approach. Frankly, the horses have left the barn from the standpoint of suppliers out there with strong market fundamental drivers for customers to want to peacefully access nuclear energy. If we, the United States, chose not to supply, not only would we would not be providing products that are absolutely the most advanced, the most efficient, comes with the strongest commitment to nonproliferation and the strongest culture of safety, with the leading regulator in the world, the NRC, having regulated our products. So number one, if we don't lead, someone's going to fill that vacuum. There are multiple motivated suppliers. So that the calculus of just not engaging, not supplying, not being a leading supplier will certainly not get us to where we would have gotten in the 90s. It's going to marginalize us, and we're going to lose our voice. That is my view. Secondly, we really do need to think long-term about having all aspects of the commercial civil nuclear cycle fully in place for these customers that are going nuclear, including the back end. So in IFNEC, we are focusing on some of these over-the-horizon or near-term, if you will, important issues. One is, the fact is, each time a country builds a nuclear reactor for the first time, that fuel goes with it. When it's discharged, you've got spent nuclear fuel. You've got plutonium in that. We want to make sure that we have a situation where the civil nuclear industry has convergence with non-pro. The convergence, in my view, is consolidated, commercially based services that removes the need for a country to conclude it needs to indigenously develop its own capabilities. One doesn't need to do that, and one can have an economically attractive multilateral approach, multilateral repository, multilateral approaches for a win-win. It's good for business, consolidated services, and it's good for non-pro. Those are the issues that we really need to look at, in my view, and we're looking at it in IFNEC right now. And also looking at some of the other gaps that we need to take to heart. We need to, in my humble opinion, given that customers are going to move forward with nuclear energy, let's try and make and support the industry to be as transparent, as Tom said, as competitive, as diverse as possible. When it comes to fuel supply, diversity is security, and security is diversity. That's where you get your security. Diverse supply market that's competitive and transparent. That's where we are working to go forward in support for the international market. And frankly, there's one last point I thought about yesterday, and that is, what's another risk with regards to, or challenge, I would say, and that is that we have a monopoly or a near monopoly in very important strategic aspects of the civil nuclear commercial cycle. We think it's very important to have multiple suppliers. We don't think it's healthy for the commercial civil nuclear market or countries deploying nuclear to be in a situation where perhaps there's only one single supplier country that is capable of providing the various services. We think it's important to have multiple, diverse, healthy supplier markets. So finally, on the opportunities. First and foremost, as I said, I think the most immediate opportunity and imperative is U.S. global civil nuclear leadership. It is really, really important. I can tell you from my perspective, with the 65 countries in IFNEC and other perspectives, the chessboard's being set now for the future global civil nuclear commercial architecture, and it is really imperative that we are involved in this, we have a strong voice in it, and we're part of the solutions going forward. Being a U.S. supplier is a key aspect of that. And secondly, we need strong bilateral working relationships with other countries that are committed to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. We need strong multilateral work. And in my view, we need to recognize that civil nuclear energy is not just a commercial civil nuclear calculus. I don't believe there's a single country I've worked with that sees it that way. They don't see it as even a customer market deciding to build a nuclear power plant, issuing a tender. They do not see it as just a commercial deal with one CEO of one company, vendor, supplier. They see it as a strategic issue. They see it as an energy security issue. They see it as a security supply issue. They'll see it as an environmental security issue. And when they respond and they look for tenders and they look for vendors, they're looking for the government too. They want that long-term relationship, multi-decade, 4 or 5 decade relationship with that government as well. And the United States, with our universities, with our labs, with our innovative industry, with our commitment to safety, commitment to non-proliferation, when we latch up for a 40-year relationship with an embarking country, we are doing what we really need to do to advance our interests, in my humble opinion. So I'm looking forward to questions and further discussion. And thank you so much, Sharon, for the opportunity to talk.
Great. Thank you. Don't fall off our stage.
I'll try not to. Ladies and gentlemen, Sharon, thank you, gentlemen. So my task, as assigned by Sharon and by the setup here, as you can see, is we have 2 experts from the United States government, one from the Department of State, one from the Department of Energy. And they have presented an approach to nuclear energy and non-proliferation, which is sensible, intelligent, and well argued. And my task is to criticize it. And I find that a tad bit daunting. Also can't seem to make my watch straight here, but it seems to me that I'd be best trying to do what Sharon assigned us to do, which is to talk about reprocessing and enrichment. And I've sort of broken that out, but I am going to depart just briefly from the remarks I prepared to say one thing which has been troubling me in Ed's presentation, trying to fulfill my job of being a critic here. The emphasis on leadership, Ed, that can cause a lot of trouble. If what we do is value leadership, we can end up doing things which should not be done because we wish to be out front leading, even if it's in the wrong direction. And that's what troubles me. Less with this administration than other administrations, but the leadership argument can be used to do things, for example, providing services. Wanting to, if the argument is we must reprocess, then we might want a leadership position. We do not want always to be in a leadership position if we can't lead people in the right direction. And I just would caution here to be careful about that as a value. Okay, so I want to talk about reprocessing and international terrorism. I want to talk about reprocessing and nuclear proliferation. And I want to talk about enrichment and the deal we made with Iran and its implications for other countries around the world. So 3 points then. This president, President Obama, has said words to the effect that nuclear terrorism is the greatest threat that confronts the United States of America. He's not alone in having made that assertion as a president. Previous presidents have said that. In debates, presidential debates, virtually all the candidates will say that, and I would predict that would be said in upcoming presidential debates. Nuclear terrorism, the greatest threat. When we use the word threat, we typically have something in mind. And to disaggregate the word or to unpack it, as they say now, it's usually thought of as a product of the magnitude of the consequences of something that happens to us and the probability that will happen. And you put those together in some way, probability and magnitude, and you get the threat. When we talk about nuclear terrorism, there isn't much debate about the magnitude of the consequences. If a true nuclear weapon, nuclear yield, happens in an American city, it will be horrendous for Americans. No question. The probability is almost always the issue. And when you get to probability, there really isn't typically much debate about whether or not there are terrorist groups that would actually use a nuclear weapon in an American city. There used to be. Remember the line about the old-fashioned terrorists? They want a lot of terror, but they don't want a lot of dead people, right? It's a political act. Not true anymore about all the groups that we see on the international scene that commit acts of international terror. So there's interest. There's not much question about that in the probability chain of logic. Then there's, can someone build, can they design a nuclear weapon? Well, it is typically said there's a lot of information out there, and yes, we can imagine a terrorist group getting some expertise and using available information to design and even build a simple nuclear device. Then the question, could they deliver it? Well, we don't have much doubt about that either, actually, as it turns out. Yes, it can be delivered. We do a lot to try to prevent it from happening, but nobody believes our borders are absolutely secure. As one wag said, put it in a big bale of marijuana, it'll get right in. Or, you know, you all have been to marinas. You know, notice all the security at the marinas. There is no security at the marinas. And so there's lots of ways we can imagine to get a nuclear weapon, even a big one, the big ugly one, into the United States of America. So not the design, not the interest, not the building of it, not the delivery of it. The long pole in the tent, as we like to say, is the fissile material, what these guys have been talking about. So for the major threat to the United States of America, it comes down to, I think, can the bad guys get the fissile material? Now, if a nuclear weapon went off in an American city today, and it was not Washington, so that we could have hearings here, a week or two later, and these gentlemen were asked, and they probably would be asked to testify, generally to the question, how could this happen? Fundamentally, the how could this happen is where could they get the fissile material? Where would it have come from? Now, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I bet that they would probably be saying variations on the following sentence. Possibly Russia, probably Pakistan. Now, I know there may be some political incorrectness in that, but I'll risk it. And Russia, not because either government would want this to happen to the United States of America, but because there simply still is a lot of material in Russia, better secured than it was 20 years ago, better secured than it was 10 years ago, and thanks largely to a number of programs, and also to the initiative of Nuclear Security Summit initiatives that this president has pursued. But still a lot of material. And the Pakistan case we're all familiar with, not only is that the fastest growing nuclear weapons program in the world today, both enrichment, highly enriched uranium, reprocessing, plutonium, right? But in weapon systems and all kinds of designs, it is growing. And we know that the situation in Pakistan is one that's, let's say, politically complicated with unquestionable vulnerabilities in terms of the people who are there, terrorist groups that reside in that country. So we'd focus on the fissile material and where it might come from. So far, so good. The proposition I have for you in my first point is a situation about where this material can come from, plausibly, may be changing in the coming year and years. If decisions are made in Northeast Asia by two countries in particular, and maybe by a third, there'll be an awful lot of plutonium in Northeast Asia that will be in vulnerable condition. And what I'm talking about here is a decision which Japan will have to make about whether to continue to postpone the construction of its reprocessing plant at Rokasho, a 500-ton throughput plant, heavy metal, spent fuel, produce, somebody can check my math, but something on the order of 4,000 kilograms of plutonium or so. I think that's what back of the envelope calculation, maybe enough for 800 nuclear weapons will be produced in this plant every year. if it comes online. It's been postponed a few times. And the form of this material will be in mixed oxide. It'll be a powdered form, be put in fuel elements and in fuel assemblies if it is used in the current generation of reactors, thermal reactors for thermal recycle. It may be stored, if not used for some predicted breeder program. But there will be a lot of plutonium available in mixed oxide form. And if it is actually used to refuel reactors, then it'll be moving around the country. It'll be in transport, another vulnerability. If China goes through eventually with the construction of a plant that France would be providing, there'd be another 500-ton plant in the energy sector producing that amount of material, again, enough for another 800 nuclear weapons each year circulating around the country. And it'll be harder if these things happen to persuade the Republic of Korea that they really are the odd country out. And they shouldn't, even though China, a nuclear weapon state, and Japan, a non-nuclear weapon state, can do this. So you might have a third country with separated plutonium in its energy sector moving all around the country in order to fuel reactors. It seems to me that if there's a failure to come to grip with this reality, we will find ourselves in a situation that is worse than the one we are in now. And that's remarkable after 4 nuclear summits. They were aimed specifically at nuclear security. But I would note, with not much emphasis on plutonium, with a very heavy emphasis on highly enriched uranium. And I don't want to criticize an emphasis on highly enriched uranium. Fine. I do want to say not enough consideration of the risks that are associated with plutonium. So why not diplomatically press Tokyo, press Beijing, Paris, not to proceed in this direction, to set that example? And please, I would not like any arguments. We can have a little bit of a discussion of this, but that this plutonium stuff is all irrelevant to terrorists. The terrorists can't make nuclear weapons with mixed oxide. It's in powdered form. Or they can't make it with plutonium that was extracted from high burn-up light water reactor fuel because of pre-ignition or some other argument. Or that there's only 2 designs for a fission device. One is simple, one is complicated. The bad guys can only do the simple one, and the simple one can't be made with plutonium. This is all bogus. And we shouldn't fall for that. Plutonium is something that can be used, any plutonium, in the manufacture of nuclear weapons, and we need to treat it that way. Second point. And that's reprocessing and nuclear proliferation. The North Koreans, you remember them, they detonated a nuclear weapon not too long ago. I think it was its 4th test. They've been testing ballistic missiles. They have medium-range ballistic missiles. They are advertising the capability of mating the nuclear weapons with the ballistic missiles, suggesting that they have gotten some thermonuclear burns. They can make a smaller design. It'll fit in the warhead, and they're on their way not only to having nuclear weapons deliverable by their ballistic missiles, the current generation, but their ICBMs, and eventually making the United States of America, the mainland, vulnerable. We can imagine all kinds of reasons why this is bad news. But the proposition I wanted to give you today was that this all creates fertile ground for discussion, at least in Seoul and Tokyo, of the desirability of breaking out of the NPT. It legitimizes the debate in those countries for the acquisition of nuclear weapons. My point here, connecting to reprocessing, is that the decisions I mentioned before, certainly the one in Tokyo and one that the South Koreans might ultimately make, to build reprocessing facilities and I don't think I have to spend much time on pyroprocessing, it is still reprocessing. To build reprocessing creates what Mark Fitzgerald has called nuclear latency. You don't need to go through that to get to the point of the availability of an overhang of plutonium that can be used to build nuclear weapons quickly. In other words, if we have had as a worst case the Pakistan case, well, we now can have in Northeast Asia a case even worse, where it is not a rapid growth of nuclear weapons as plutonium is produced, or highly enriched uranium for the manufacture of the weapons, but it's a step function because the pile of plutonium is already there, rationalized by a nuclear energy program that somehow needs plutonium. And so the point I have here is that we are, again, with a too easy approach to the commercial reprocessing for, quote, energy reasons, allowing a situation to develop that is a kind of proliferation by the accumulation of plutonium. That is something we shouldn't do. The arguments here, you can look at the Blue Ribbon Commission, there is not a good economic energy argument for the separation of plutonium from spent fuel. There's not a good argument in terms of radioactive waste management. There's not a good argument in terms of near-term need for your breeder reactor program. There just isn't a good argument other than a need to have a nuclear weapons latent program. And that we ought to worry about, and we ought to take a very strong position against. The final point I wanted to make goes to enrichment and the deal with Iran. Let me start this point by simply saying I am an enthusiastic supporter of the deal that was cut with Iran, JCPOA. I believe that it stopped a nuclear weapons program in Iran. I mean two things by that. I don't mean it destroyed for all time. I mean it stopped as in halted what I believe was, if not an active nuclear weapons program, it was a program to produce a nuclear weapons option in Iran. And that has been stopped with, as best I can tell, no war and no death. So, good. The kind of however that I think needs to follow that is that the deal, though, is not the one that some years before many of us had said we should hold out for. I know the problems of a negotiator, and I know why sometimes you can't get what you want in a negotiation. But we didn't want any enrichment in Iran. And we said we didn't because we didn't want the precedent of Iran with an enrichment program that would be legitimized by a deal that said it's okay to have centrifuges. Well, that's what we got. We have a deal in which Iran can keep a small fraction of what they would have had otherwise, please. But it legitimizes the centrifuge program. It legitimizes centrifuge research. And more than that, the critical restraint, and for me, you can have your favorite restraint in this agreement. The agreement has a lot of restraints. The critical restraint, there will be no enrichment to HEU, high enriched uranium above 30%, right? But this is time limited. As most of the agreement's restrictions are, some 10 years, some 15, some 25 years, some indefinite, but mostly 15 years. So my point here is that while the administration is clear about not wanting enrichment to spread around the world, we, I would say, in the administration's defense, had to make a deal, if we were going to make a deal, that legitimized uranium enrichment in a country that has no need for uranium enrichment. Yes, it has one light water reactor. It has no need for an independent enrichment capability. There are a lot of SWUs, separative work units, enrichment capacity. There's a lot around the world in diverse hands. There was no need for this, and we have set a precedent which is dangerous. And that needs to be coped with by the administration. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you. More or less, you sort of did. Or at least we have a lot of issues on the table at this point. Let me start with a question or two, and then I know there are some folks in the audience who will have questions, so gather your thoughts together. I'll start with a few simple ones. Transparency. This is something I think, Tom, you've testified in front of Congress. You've made some remarks about transparency. Ed, you also mentioned transparency. Could you provide a few more details? What is a transparent nuclear relationship look like? Or I'm not going to mention the gold standard, but what are some of the things you would hope for?
Well, as I spoke about transparency, I was thinking primarily about the financial and economic arrangements. In the current environment, different countries are offering different financial incentives, different financing options for construction of nuclear power plants. Industries or companies that are nominally private, in fact, receive some kind of subsidy, some kind of state loan guarantees. The rules for nuclear power are complex, and in some ways there are fewer rules for building a nuclear power plant than they are for other kinds of international trade, such as steel or automobiles, where subsidies are easier to detect and possible to discourage or prevent. In the case of nuclear fuel, because it is not immediately, nuclear power, because it is not immediately competitive price-wise with, at this moment, natural gas in the United States or natural gas or oil in most other countries, and the decision is made, as Ed said, to build a strategic partnership or a strategic reserve for energy and environmental security on something other than straight market grounds. Because of all those factors, the financing becomes complex. Complexity does not need to be secret. It is essential, if there's going to be popular support in any country for the construction of a nuclear power plant, that the terms of the deal be transparent when the deal is signed. Who is putting up the money? Who has ownership? What is the nature of the loan guarantees? What are repayment terms? And, as best as possible, what is the price of electricity to be generated? Are there price guarantees built in for either the utility or for the provider of the equipment? Without all of that information, there will be suspicion about side payments to those individuals in any government who are making those decisions. My own view, and it comes from working many years on Balkans and Middle East issues, and is not exactly relevant to this discussion, is that the number one threat to world stability is corruption. And you've heard Secretary Kerry speak about that ever more often this year. That governments which seem to exist only for the purpose of enriching government officials will inevitably lose the trust of their people, no matter how they were chosen or elected. The government of Ukraine fell not because of nationalism, not because of a burning desire for democracy, but because millions of Ukrainians asked a simple question, a question that's still too dangerous to ask in places like Moscow. How did our president become a billionaire? It's an unfortunate truth that with billions of dollars at stake in any single nuclear reactor deal, the temptation of state agencies to bribe government officials, and the temptation of deciding government officials to take bribes is very high and is dangerous not just for the government that's foolish enough to engage in corrupt practices, but it's dangerous for the nuclear prospects in that country and globally.
This goes back to, I think, kind of a point that Bob made about the kind of be careful what you wish for on the leadership end of it, right? So when you look at countries that are interested in nuclear power, and you overlay it with whatever you want, the corruption index or failed states index or what have you, there's a pretty high correlation there. So while we can say, gee, if we don't go in and sell nuclear power plants there, you know, the alternatives are worse than us, what risks are we willing to take? And do our companies, are they eager to go into places, I'm not going to name states because I don't want to get you guys in trouble, but places that don't do so well in terms of rule of law and regulatory cleanliness, shall we say?
So I appreciate, Bob, you mentioning that, and Sharon, and I think it's how do you define leadership? Certainly the way I define leadership, I think it is absolutely important, appreciated by partners, and would not result in irresponsibly pushing nuclear, because that's not what we're about. Our objective is not to try and convince countries to go nuclear. That is not our policy. Our policy is safety, security, safe use, peaceful use, and recognizing the right of a country to make its own decision, provided it is ready and provided it is doing it for peaceful purposes. So when you talk about leadership, what I think about is, and I'm a bit biased mentioning the international framework, but I think it's a great example. When we first proposed and established the international framework, it was the U.S. who actually stepped up as a leader and proposed it. But what we proposed is a completely co-equal framework, business-oriented, based on what we agree on, not what we disagree on, respecting the right of each country to peacefully access. And after many, many years, we have a very harmonious international framework that consists of even countries with contrapposing policies like Germany and Italy, and we're all constructively working together. They're co-equal, we resisted a hierarchical structure, and I would call that leadership. I think other examples of leadership is when a country reaches out to the United States because of our deep experience and because many of the countries know that for public acceptance, they need to assure that they're not endangering their own citizens. What better way to do it than to go to the bar none, most capable, most reputable regulator in the world for safety, the US NRC, and all the products that come out of it. So when a country comes to us, and perhaps it's a country that is not even close to being ready, I think leadership is that we, first of all, exercise empathy. Not sympathy, but empathy, trying to understand why is it that they're coming in and coming to this conclusion and feeling like they need to do this. I talked about the drivers. They're real palpable drivers here. And then secondly, we can share with them. Leadership is sharing our experiences so they can come to their own conclusion. Wow, I just went to a couple of the sites in the US and I just heard about their history. You know what? I don't think we're even anywhere close to being ready. I better go back and brief up my minister because there's no way we're going to be able to do all of this in the next 6 years as we plan. So it's leadership, in my view, is a respectful engagement, exercising, trying to see it from their perspective so we can have greater appreciation, reminding ourselves what our overall imperatives are from the United States as a USG official, and seeking to collectively go at these issues proactively. It is not one big advocacy. The benefit is, at times, there are markets that are ready and that are seeking long-term, multi-decade commercial and government relationships with the United States, and that's when we have win-wins. We have Westinghouse, we have GE, we have some other SMRs, we have other suppliers And that's the win-win when in many of these cases, we're offering consolidated services. That's what you want in non-pro. You're offering safest products in the world with a bar none, unmatched commitment for non-pro. That's how I define leadership.
Let me add, and I also wanted to express appreciation for Ambassador Gallucci's point about leadership. I think we can think of times in recent years when the U.S. has exercised leadership for its own sake and marched off in the wrong direction with very few followers behind it. When we talk about leadership in this field, to expand upon Ed's thought, there was a time, not that long ago, when United States technological leadership in the nuclear field was so great that it gave us great power in the negotiation of 1, 2, 3 agreements and the negotiation of commercial deals. The fact is, we no longer have that technological lead. There are other countries with near equal technological capabilities. We have to have a leadership of values. I think Ed used the word, that we embody the highest values, not just of security and safety and non-proliferation, but also of cooperation. And it's that leadership of values that I think will impel many countries to continue to seek first partnership with the U.S. rather than with the used car salesman who says, no money down, you can pay me later. I think that's the approach that the U.S. has to take.
So I'm going to be a little controversial here because this argument, when I look back at our negotiations with certain states, it seems that we have in the past had incredible leverage and we sought not to use it. And I'll give one example here, Japan, and the decision to provide advance consent when they were working on Tokai, right? So this is going back to the Carter administration. I've been doing a lot of reading lately. 1977, right? The Carter administration, this may be the example you were thinking of, when we marched off in the wrong direction and we said,
no,
we're not, okay, that's okay. Well, then I want to hear what you were thinking of. You know, thou shalt not reprocess, this is a bad idea. You know, even Henry Kissinger said, plutonium, a bad idea. This is a risk we really hadn't we hadn't understood the full complexity of this. Right, so the Carter administration, you know, at the time, Japan was about to start Tokai, but it hadn't. And the classified documents that have been declassified showed that we developed 3 options. One was to say, okay, well, you can only reprocess our stuff at Tokai if you only do co-processing, right? So this is the technical solution. Co-processing, you don't separate out the plutonium. And Ambassador Mansfield at the time said, no, no, that's a terrible idea. The Japanese will never buy that. So the other 2 options, and we finally decided on the second one, the other 2 options were, well, you can do, operate Tokai on just as a safeguards test bed. Well, not so bad, but not so great. Option 2, the one we decided on, was we'll let Tokai go forward, just as it's been done because of commercial reasons, cost reasons, all those things. They had put the plant together and they were anxious to demonstrate the capability. And we'll limit what it can do, just like we're doing with Iran, right? We're going to limit, we're going to say Iran can't enrich to HEU. We're going to say Tokai capacity only 70 tons, whatever. And we'll throw in some safeguards. Well, all of the arguments 10 years later, when we were negotiating the 123 agreement, was that Japan's going to go down this road. They're going to do what they're going to do anyway. We don't have any leverage. All we can do is sort of, urge them. When you look back on that, 40 years later, it seems to me maybe we had more leverage than we thought, and we missed an opportunity. And in that 123 agreement, which exists into perpetuity now, right? Does not need to be renewed, even though the 30-year term ends in 2018. Japan has carte blanche to reprocess forever, even though it has nowhere for that plutonium to go right now. So I wonder, you know, I mean, it's hindsight is always 20/20, right? But what the real critical questions I would love to see us discuss here in conjunction with the audience is, you know, what are our real sources of leverage? Is it, you know, is there something new in the technical field, Ed, that you've been working on that we haven't heard about? Are there diplomatic approaches? Maybe this new thrust towards transparency to level the playing field across suppliers, maybe that's helpful. I just think that we don't really use the leverage when we have it. Taking into account, Bob, what you said that, you know, when you're sitting in the negotiating room, it's tough, right?
That's why you get the big bucks, though.
That's right. all the glory.
And all the glory.
I'm happy to listen to thoughts on this, but I think it was Robert De Niro who said, if you have to talk about your leverage, then you don't really have it. So I'm happy to hear other folks' comments, though.
All right, well, maybe we have some questions about leverage or certain cases in the audience. I see Henry. Please, so our rule is identify yourself, your affiliation, and try to make it into a question, even if it isn't. And there are, do we have
And what would lead her to say
microphones
Just put a question
that are
like
coming around? It's coming? It's coming? Well, since we're webcasting this, we like everybody to hear what you're saying.
Henry Sokolsky, Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. On the 16th of March, the Secretary of Energy said, we don't support large-scale reprocessing, and in regard to China's latest announcement that it would proceed to commercial-scale reprocessing, he noted that it certainly isn't a positive in terms of non-proliferation. Someone else who actually is present here, Ambassador Countryman, when asked about what his thoughts were about taking a time out in commercial plutonium in East Asia, said, I would be very happy to see all countries get out of the plutonium reprocessing business, and went on to note that there are genuine questions where it is important that the U.S. and its partners in Asia have a common understanding of the economic and non-proliferation issues at stake before making a decision about the renewal of the 123 Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, for example, with Japan. Now, the question I have is some commentators and journalists downgraded and sort of said, well, there's nothing there. I'm wondering if you would be interested in expanding in any way on those comments to make it clear to them that maybe there is something to what was said.
You want to talk about Ernie's comments?
You talk about your comments.
Oh, okay. Yes, I've attempted to do that with Japanese journalists, and I'll attempt again. I've made two different statements about Japan's policy. I do not believe the two statements are in any way contradicting each other. But some folks only want to hear one of the statements, and some folks only want to hear the other of the statements. One statement that I made on March 17th to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is absolutely true. From a non-proliferation standpoint, it would be better if no countries were in the plutonium separation business. The other statement I've made, which is equally true, is that Japan's choice of a fuel cycle is a decision for Japan, and it is not the job of the United States government to endorse or to oppose that choice. Those two things, to me, are entirely consistent, but if somebody is having a problem with that, we can talk about it. What I've said further applies not only to Japan, but to other partners, which is that any country that wants to be in that business must have, not only with the United States, but with its own people, a complete and transparent discussion of the economic and non-proliferation and national security issues involved in such a choice. I think that's clear.
May I?
Yeah, please.
So I understand the proposition that Japan is a sovereign country. This is a decision about how it will meet its energy needs, and it has the right to make that decision. Got it. But what we've been talking about here is that that decision by Japan about how it will meet its energy needs, this is an energy decision. I mean, this is not a national security issue, it's an energy question, affects the national security of the United States and its neighbors in Northeast Asia. It is a matter of international security. Mm-hmm. So I think this gets down to how governments relate one to the other. It gets down to internal debates about what will be said in the instruction cable to the ambassador or to the assistant secretary who's going to go out there or to whomever is going to deliver the message. How strong and how clear do you want to be that you sacrifice our interests if you decide one way rather than another? That we will care about this, that this is a problem for us. You know, there's a continuum, as you both know, of where you go on this, and that's something you struggle with. But if I could put it this way, if I had a complaint here, it is really one that follows from not knowing exactly, and I shouldn't know exactly, I do not work for the government right now, not knowing exactly how clear, how forceful we have been. I would note, so you don't have to, that this can be counterproductive. If you're not careful when the United States of America says something that doesn't seem to respect the sovereignty of another country, you can get precisely what you'd rather not get. I get that, right? But I think what we're really talking about here, because we have not had three people, up here who then went to the podium who disagree fundamentally about reprocessing or enrichment. You know, this is not, forgive me, but the Bush administration. And so I don't have to go through this as we did before. Got that. We're really talking about how we manage this situation with, in this case, one ally, treaty ally, Japan, and something other than a treaty ally, China, a peer competitor, another ally, France, and another ally, the Republic of Korea. So I think it's the way you engage and express your interests over how they make this sovereign energy choice.
Exactly.
Can you comment on Secretary Moniz's comment, or will that get you in
It was pretty good.
Tom said it best. Let me just, for the sake of advancing the discussion, let me just add a different perspective from a commercial civil nuclear perspective. First of all, as we know, the U.S. has a direct national disposal approach. We have great faith in dry cask storage. We believe that dry cask storage gives us many different benefits and options, including time, to further explore other potential technical pathways that could be possibly validated by DOE, and at some time maybe policymakers consider. Ones that really try and go at the issues of safeguardability, transparency, and other issues. But the fact is we have a direct national disposal program, and the fact is, from a business perspective, in my view, it makes a lot of business sense. We have, particularly when you look at the market and you look at a sustainability perspective, as I said, you've got an expansion going on. It is very, very important, in my view, that we offer a commercially incentive, rational approach. A commercially rational approach for a country that has plans to build 4 reactors, first of all, is not going to be to build indigenous facilities. In fact, they may not have any desire even to build a repository. Ultimately, they do have to have responsibility for whatever they plan to do. But there is a strong market, in my view, ready to be tapped that would be to the benefit of non-pro by industry for consolidated multilateral disposal. That, in my view, is a long-term, systemic, positive approach to addressing the concerns for development of reprocessing, and even with regards to having a robust multiple supplier fuel supply market, SWU, uranium, the whole front end. The best answer, in my view, to address the risk of proliferation is to remove the incentive. You remove the incentive by making clear with transparency that there is you can rest as an energy planning authority in a country confident that if you rely on a commercial market for long term, you can rest assured with the multiple suppliers, with the competitive nature, with the transparency, you can rest assured on behalf of your citizens that it's a good way to go, a reliable way to go.
So on multilateral storage and/or
Disposal.
Yes. Are you working that within IFNEC?
And IFNEC is one of the few, now I would say IAEA is starting to look at it more as well. But IFNEC has really been working on it for about 5 years or so. And we have flipped the entire approach. Rather than trying to start at the site and start with the name of a country and a location and community, we've decided maybe that's not such a good way to go. Let's look at, first of all, bringing together the suppliers and the potential countries, most of which are represented in IFNEC. Let's bring them together and start top down. What are the necessary architecture elements? Bilateral, multilateral agreements, third country transfers, liability issue, regulatory. What would be who owns the title? What's the market? How large of a market would you need? How many reactors for 40 years each? Maybe if you get about lifetime of 800 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel, what is the business? How many would you need? Would you need an order of maybe 20 units lifetime to really have this business become self-sustaining with the appropriate margins? And again, this is a non-pro benefit because you're consolidating. We're looking at all of that. France and actually the United Arab Emirates are the co-chairs of this working group at this time. And we're going to be meeting in Paris. In fact, we're going to be receiving a briefing from our Australian colleagues to tell us what they're doing with regards to this very interesting work that they're looking at for potential multilateral disposal there from an economics benefit perspective. So we are working hard to try and get some harmonization politically and from energy business perspective if and when the day comes when a country decides collectively with its citizens that they are interested in fulfilling that most interesting and potentially most important from a non-pro perspective role.
So when that becomes a norm, I'll keep my fingers crossed, maybe in my lifetime, then will we be more negative about reprocessing? Because countries that will be interested in that, I mean...
This is the U.S. perspective. You don't need reprocessing right now. Dry cask storage, long-term storage works perfectly fine. There's a lot of good work out there being done to try and advance the technology. And business-wise, think about it. Like you said, who knows? In the next 15, 20 years, there could be one or more countries saying, I got it, I get it, my public, my citizen, my colleagues get it, In ex-country, we see it as a win-win-win. We can perform a very important non-proliferation perspective. It can be great for our community, jobs, revenue, and we're ready to be that location. But the one thing that we've learned is what you cannot do, what is the worst thing you can do, and this is the wrong way to lead, I think, is try and tell a country they should do it. It cannot be that. It needs to be a country and the stakeholders' decisions. They need to believe it, and they need to come up with that decision on their own. That's why it's very interesting to see what's happening in Australia. And there's been no involvement. It's just been organically developed as a consideration.
Thank you. Stephanie. Wait for the microphone, please.
Stephanie Cook, Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. I've been covering the industry for quite a while now, off and on, and it seems to me that since Presidents Ford and Carter came out with the anti-reprocessing, anti-breeder policy, our policies have kind of changed, kind of seesawed over the decades. And for example, this led to the Bush administration in the early 2000s coming up with this idea of pyroprocessing and MOX use, and then this led subsequently to the PDMA and the protocol in 2010 actually saying that we're committed to MOX. So from an international perspective, I think and certainly from my own perspective, I get quite confused about where we stand on this sometimes. I can see that the administration has come out with some strong statements about reprocessing of late. But for a while, especially in the first half of the administration, I was confused about where it stood and what the messaging to Japan was. And I just think that this seesawing is creating a problem. And I wonder if someone, perhaps Ed, could address that or
Well, I appreciate your points. With regards to how we communicate to Japan on this, I would defer to Tom. But again, well, let me just elaborate. One other point on the potential incredibly important non-proliferation role that could be performed by the commercial market. In my view, there have been some incredibly innovative, very successful convergences of industry and national security. AGU purchase agreement, prime example. And I think there are other concepts and ideas innovative that reflects leadership waiting to be had. I think the multilateral approaches are very important. Look at the uranium market. It is very low right now, the price extremely low. There's plenty of uranium out there. There's some very interesting technology activities happening, R&D, uranium extraction from seawater. That would be groundbreaking. That would be game-changing if that were proven out at economy of scale. I believe it is now, as I understand it, maybe 15 times the price of current market. If you can get close to maybe 7, 8 times factor the market price, that could be very, very significant. Time is our ally when it comes to these issues right now as far as technology development using dry gas interim storage as an ally and pushing the envelope in other ways. As far as what we've been, what we would say, what we've said to Japan, I'll defer to Tom.
Well, first a point about the PMDA, and not to go into recent press reports, but just to say that the PMDA and the effort, that's the Plutonium Management Disposition Agreement between the US and the Russian Federation, and the efforts to implement it underline a point that Ambassador Gallucci made. And to rephrase his point slightly, plutonium's value is negative. It is not an economic good. It costs an incredible amount of money to do away with it, to store it securely. And finding the least cost way to dispose of the ridiculous amounts of plutonium that the United States and the Russian Federation possess is what leads to a change in direction, as decided by the Department of Energy. Now, our relationship with Japan. First, Japan has always been our best partner globally in every major non-proliferation forum. Japan has not violated any of its non-proliferation commitments, ever. It has all of its facilities, including reprocessing facility and box burning reactors, under full safeguards of the IAEA. It has adopted a clear policy of not possessing plutonium whose use is not anticipated. And it has stuck to that policy in a transparent manner. For all those reasons, our bilateral discussion with Japan is confidential, respectful, and on the basis of equality. We don't have better partners in this field. And we don't do our negotiation at big round tables. That's how I describe our discussion with Japan.
Tom Cochran, retired. Mr. Countryman, I know it's been recommended to the administration and to you that the P5+1 form an expert group to look at the JCPOA and see if there's anything worth internationalizing. I would like to get your feedback. I know you've thought about this, on what might the administration support in that regard.
I'm sorry, do you mean internationalizing in the sense?
You made, the P5+1 has agreements with Iran on limitations of reprocessing and enrichment.
Yep.
What in that agreement is worthy of the P5+1 taking and applying it universally?
Okay.
And what is the best process for getting that started?
Okay. No, it's a great question. It's a difficult one because, as you know, when the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency adopted the decisions that operationalized the JCPOA so that the IAEA could do its share of the work, the lion's share of the work on implementation, several members of the Board of Governors insisted on a preambular statement there that said this shall not be considered a precedent for other countries. In other words, some members of the Board of Governors said the agreement that Iran has made for special monitoring procedures that go beyond normal safeguards and go beyond even the additional protocol, you can't expect it to apply that to every other country in the world. And there's a certain amount of logic to that. There is no other country in the world that had been in such blatant contravention of its obligations to the IAEA than Iran, North Korea being a still extraterrestrial case. Some of the ideas are good ones, and they are essential in the case of Iran to satisfy the desire of everybody, the U.S. Congress, and our allies, all the members of the 5+1, and Iran's neighbors, that there is no covert program or any other path to a nuclear weapon in Iran. And I think that they will do that. They're good steps. And they are also, in a sense, cutting-edge steps. I think we'll see the IAEA adopt new technologies, procedures, working methods in order to become more effective in Iran. And so that's kind of the answer. What's the best way to go about this, about internationalizing? the necessary step is to make the JCPOA work, to give the IAEA the full support for its resources, its expertise, its independence, so that it can make these measures work in Iran. And at that point, with a demonstrated record of success in Iran, then we can discuss should these be made applicable to more countries that are under IAEA safeguards. But I don't think we start by saying up front, these are such great ideas, our ambition is to apply them to the whole world. It would be counterproductive if that were the policy at this point.
Can I follow?
Sure.
Would some of those things include, for example, continuous monitoring at enrichment plants?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, yeah, okay. Yeah, and monitoring supply chain. I mean, there's not a whole lot. There's not that much that's new there, but at least I remember from our experience in Iraq, that was the first time we applied, for example, environmental sampling.
Yep.
That was eventually adopted by the IAEA as a monitoring technique. So there is some potential there, but I agree it's politically challenging. I saw a lot of hands in the back of the room. What happened to them? Jungmin first, and then the gentleman behind him.
Jungmin Kang, NRDC. I have a question for Mr. Countryman. About 2 weeks ago, there was a high-level meeting in Seoul between South Korea and U.S. government on new 123 agreement. Could you explain about what has been talked about enrichment and the pilot processing?
No. Last week was the first meeting of the high-level bilateral commission 1 week ago today. This commission was created by the ROK US 123 agreement that we negotiated and completed last year and was approved by Congress last year. And we agreed to an annual meeting of this very high-level body chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Energy and the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so I think I'm going to give this question to somebody who was there.
It was extremely positive. I think we have so many different common areas of interest. I have the pleasure of serving as a co-chair of one of the 4 working groups. And I would say that it's fair to say that we use this first meeting to really initially just acknowledge, take stock as to what we want to do in the coming year or so. And certainly from my working group, our experts are already planning to get together now to identify areas that we could work on that would be mutually beneficial, whether it is additional action steps, cooperation, information sharing that the U.S. and Korea can do to reinforce front-end security of supply. Korea, I believe it's about 90% of its energy is imported. And so they have legitimate points to make to want to really address security of supply. The good news is they have multiple suppliers in place now for their nuclear power plants. I believe it's at least 4 contractually in place. That's not bad. As I indicated, diversity is security in my view, in my world, in the supply world, and security is diversity. And we're also looking at other important areas, including international multilateral issues. What can we do to reinforce access while reinforcing non-proliferation, including multilateral disposal issues? They are an important member of IFNEC, and they work with us collectively on these issues. So I can speak to my area, what we're planning to look into.
There's another question behind John.
Doug Hausing, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is kind of a different question. Last October, the GAO issued a report on the domestic enrichment in the United States and issues surrounding the capability of the U.S. to domestically enrich. Is that report having any influence on policy for non-proliferation?
Apparently not.
I can get back. I can get back with you on that one. I don't want to give you an answer when I'm not the lead, and that's not. Other than the fact that enrichment is SWU, very important in this country. We have LES, that's important. And so having multiple suppliers is very important.
Well, having, and the reason is just because there's a lot of uranium available, what you can do with it and whose technology is used to enrichment kind of puts some constraints on that. Mm-hmm. And based on that report, we were just curious, is that report somehow influencing, you know, any non-proliferation issues?
It hasn't yet influenced me, but now you are forcing me to go read it.
Well, so I'll follow up since I don't see any more hands. This whole, yeah, there are more. All right. I'm still going to get my question.
I know you
don't worry.
Nice try.
Milton Honig, shouldn't we actually be concerned about the implementation of civil nuclear security after what we learned following the terrorist incidents in Belgium, both at the metro station and the airport, specifically connection with things at Belgium's nuclear facilities, for instance, the footage being taken of an official at Mole, and at the 2 nuclear reactors there were incidents. In one of them there were insiders, workers who left and joined ISIS, and one was killed, another came back, he's in prison. And at the other facility, a guard was killed. We aren't sure it was who was behind that, whether it was ISIS or not. And someone else earlier had drained lubricant from one of the turbines. So, I mean, this is an indication of, although you have this grand international involvement of the IEA and the NRC is giving a lot of advice, this is a real screw-up as far as I'm concerned. And so I think it's an indication that maybe things aren't working as they should.
Well, the role of the regulator, security and safety, is paramount. That is absolutely got to be paramount, and you need transparency in that. We're very fortunate to have the U.S. NRC as strong as it is, and I can tell you wherever I go around the world, we emphasize that first and foremost. Like Tom said, before you even contemplate deploying a nuclear power plant, it is essential. You've got the infrastructure in place, you have the capabilities, and you have a strong, independent, effective regulator that calls it like it is and resists pressures one way or another. That is very important. It doesn't solve immediately the issue you're talking about, but that has got to be the case. An independent, effective, capable, transparent regulator.
Couple of comments, and without validating or denying any of the points about Belgium that you mentioned, but speaking more generally. First, the meaning of nuclear security as contained in the President's initiative is principally about securing fissile material so that it is not possible for terrorists to get their hands on enough to make an improvised nuclear explosive device. The meaning at the summit has been stretched somewhat over the years to include protection of radiological sources so that terrorists can't construct a dirty bomb. And at this final summit, there also was a broader discussion about terrorist interest and use of chemical or biological weapons. But the main meaning of nuclear security itself, the events in Belgium don't change our assessment that the security, the protection of fissile material in Belgium, and for that matter throughout Western Europe, is solid. There is a different question, of course, and that is how attractive are any nuclear facilities as a target of sabotage or terrorism? Do they have an attractiveness that simply attacking a nuclear power plant will cause more public mayhem and distraction than attacking a natural gas burning power plant? The answer is probably yes. Terrorists will get more publicity for shooting up the fence at a nuclear power plant than at a hydroelectric dam. Again, there probably are lessons that need to be drawn, as there are after every terrorist incident, about the physical security of the plant itself and its vulnerability to sabotage or direct attack. Is there more that needs to be done? As you say, the answer is obviously yes, just as there is on our cyber vulnerabilities to attack at major industrial installations and infrastructure installations. I don't think that nuclear is unique in that sense, but you do get a few extra headlines, and that has to be addressed.
I have one Dan Horner here, and then Deborah in the back.
Hi, Dan Horner from Arms Control Today. There were a couple references made to the public statements from Mr. Countryman and Secretary Muniz and others recently. I think most people assume that there was a deliberate decision to put more emphasis on this issue or give it a higher profile. If that's the case, and if one accepts the arguments that Bob Gallucci was making, that a main locus of the issue is in East Asia, can you explain the timing for this push? In the last year of the administration, and probably more importantly, a year after the nuclear cooperation agreement for two of the countries we're talking about, South Korea and China, were considered in Congress. Thanks.
Very briefly, I can't speak for Secretary Muniz. I made a deliberate decision to answer frankly a question put to me by a senator.
And the message coming out of Secretary Muniz is what we've been saying all along. Our message is consistent and unchanged.
Deborah's question in the back, and then we'll be
Deborah
wrapping up.
Decker, the Stimson Center. Thank you for being here. I will be at the IFNEC conference coming up on the one on financing,
Yes.
right after that. And the Stimson Center came out with a report on the need for nuclear security standards, the possibility of voluntary consensus standards, and this goes to the Belgian plant question. One of the things that we've seen is that general public seems to think that the IAEA has standards in place and that regulators adopt this. As the NTI has pointed out, Nuclear Threat Initiative, that the even physical security standards, the InfoCirc 225 Rev 5 has not been universally adopted. I've met with the head Spanish, French, I met many NRC regulators, and there's such unevenness in this. One of the things that we've discussed is the potential for having, as you're talking about transparency in financing, having certain standards be part of that export financing package. Do you think that there's any potential for that, maybe as coming out of this conference in the future? And this is the IFNEC question.
I think it's fair to say when it comes to financing in nuclear power plants, transparency, more transparency, the better. Of course, you have issues where it is proprietary, certain aspects of finance negotiations and agreements, and you have other sensitive competitive issues. But there's absolutely no reason why we can't even enhance the transparency of these very, very significant multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade deals and projects. They're too important to be opaque, my view. Of course, again, we have to respect the nature of the negotiations and who's coming in, whether it's it's for debt financing or equity investors. And we are going to be holding a meeting for 2 days in Paris in May 11 and 12 under the auspices of the 65 countries of IFNEC and also the countries of NEA. Pleased to say that Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, is going to be keynoting it. And we're going to be not only talking about the broader context of civil nuclear and the challenges of financing, but what can we collectively do, including virtually every one of the suppliers that's going to be there, and many of the customers. Transparency is really important, and we should work and endeavor to enhance that transparency. It only helps to enhance market confidence, customer confidence, and ultimately public confidence. So we will see. I can't predict what findings are going to come out, but I'm hoping for some substantial and value-added findings.
So I'm going to use the last 2 minutes, 3 minutes, to follow up on something that Bob left on the table, which has been unanswered, and that is Iran. And the fact that once the JCPOA ends, and God willing, knock on wood, that it succeeds for the length of its duration, there may come a time when Iran simply says, well, yes, we're going to move forward. We're going to enrich to highly enriched uranium because we have a new naval submarine program and all of this is legitimate. You know, one of the reasons why we have these conversations with allies like Japan and South Korea is because we have a 123 agreement with them and we have leverage. With Iran, we will not have that, presumably for a long time. We are not going to engage in nuclear cooperation with them or sign an agreement with them. So we will essentially be left with saying what exactly you said about Japan, which is, gosh, it's their choice. I mean, in order to be non-discriminatory, we will have to say, well, that is Iran's choice to make decisions about its fuel cycle. And reprocessing will not necessarily be off the table either. So I think the question, Tom Cochran, is not, you know, what of these things in the JCPOA do we have to extend further to universalize, but how do we ultimately deal with this question of sovereignty and the fuel cycle? I mean, are these things dangerous enough that we actually have to have a universal conversation or a bigger conversation about, well, maybe we should move to all multilateral enrichment or reprocessing or something else? I mean, there are people in this audience who have written books on this topic. I don't expect you're going to be able to say, yes, we should move forward, but this is a fundamental issue that we've not been able to grapple with over time. Is it important enough that we look at global solutions? So you're welcome to try to answer that or just make a final comment. We'll go down the row and...
I'll just answer it with a few ambiguous aphorisms. The first would be the United States respects sovereignty, but non-proliferation is probably more important to us than other countries' perceptions of sovereignty. Secondly, the United States also has a right to sovereignty, and that includes a choice not to cooperate or to take even negative measures against countries that exercise their sovereignty in a way damaging to global security. It's what we did with unilateral Iran sanctions. That's our sovereignty. Third, sovereignty is always compromised by international agreement. To me, the most important multilateral agreement, the most successful multilateral agreement, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which 190 nations gave up a huge chunk of sovereignty for their own benefit and for the benefit of the world. And this is one reason I don't say that sovereignty is an absolute right. In fact, I've seen it used by too many states as an excuse. Final point is, I don't mind the United States being called discriminatory. Yes, we do discriminate between countries that have a record of meeting their international obligation and countries that have a record of violating international obligations in terrorism, in human rights, and in other areas. I have no problem in discriminating between Japan and Iran. Finally, I don't think that South Korea and Japan and China and others listen to us only because we have a 1-2-3 agreement with them. That is not the basis of our friendship with allies like Seoul or Tokyo. And it is not dependent upon a 1-2-3 whether or not we have leverage with a recalcitrant Iran 15 years from now.
Well, as I said, the expansion is happening. Countries are developing nuclear for the first time, regardless. I would say the good news is the vast majority of the countries I work with, they seem to be genuinely driven for having a safe, secure capacity for electricity generation. But there are incredible challenges. Many of these countries are almost literally between a rock and a hard place. They have great energy security challenges, and they're driven out of necessity in many of their views to try and develop clean baseload civil nuclear as part of their options. Many countries reach out to the United States and very much want us to work with them. I was just recently in Vietnam. The desire, the enthusiasm by the technical experts in Venatum, in EVN, in Varans is extremely strong and positive with the United States. They're reaching out to us. That's leadership when we reciprocate, we respectfully engage. It doesn't mean we endorse everything they do, and we lead by example, and we recognize that civil nuclear is going to be a very, very important set of, serving a number of very important environmental and energy security roles, economic roles. And I, for one, want to see the United States in a leadership role, and I want to make sure whatever way I can do to support that, because it's not a question of whether nuclear is going to be around. It's going to be a question of who are the controlling suppliers, who are the main suppliers. And with that comes the safety culture, the security culture, non-proliferation commitments. So very important, in my view, for us to be in a leadership role in this very dynamic and changing global civil nuclear state of play.
Thank you, Bob.
It occurred to me, Sharon, that behind your question about Iran and when it becomes free of the restraints in the JCPOA, it can do these things. I went into government 42 years ago, and it was startling to discover that the NPT, while wonderful in so many ways, was permissive, indeed encouraged reprocessing and enrichment. And so we immediately, not me so much, others, created the London Club, which became the Nuclear Suppliers Group, to create what Tom described as a basis for discrimination that we could defend in some way politically. So what you're describing is something we've been struggling with in this field forever. I winced a little bit at the multilateral solution because I have been a victim of the efforts to create multilateral reprocessing, multilateral enrichment, multilateral fuel storage. I get it, it would be lovely. But in the meantime, you better have another plan, because it doesn't happen very quickly. And the other plan to get to the Iran case of what happens at the end of this little rainbow, the end of the road that you kick the can down, is you have a full-throated relationship and discussion. And as has been noted by my colleagues, it isn't bound, when we're talking about these issues, by an agreement of some kind. It is bound by all the, or unbound in it, and it is worked out in the context of a security relationship that's quite broad. So I'm not unhappy about the prospect of engaging Iran. I don't think we'll have to break it to them that we're not going to necessarily treat them like Japan. I think they know that. So.
All right. Listen, thank you all for participating, and please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.